Okay, if everybody can take their seats, then we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Eric Schnurer. I'm the founder of the Greater Good Gathering. I'd like to say a few quick words about where this event came from, what's happening over the next 24 hours or so, and where we're headed after that. The roots of this event lay in a variety of discussions concerning the future of government in an age of rapidly advancing technology. It's my belief that digital and social technologies will disrupt and reconfigure the government business just as much as any other industry in the decades ahead. That means we need to rethink what it means to advance the greater good, because it won't be something we do collectively through or just through public institutions, and public policy needs to be rethought as something that isn't just done by the public sector. That was the basis for the launch of this annual conference. As you'll hear more about tomorrow, most of the students here at SEPA are already thinking in those terms about their careers already. But this requires some shared conception of the greater good, hence the name of the conference. To me, this has nothing to do with partisan politics. In fact, somewhere out in the lobby, I think we actually have a Republican. I don't quite see him in the room, but you'll be hearing from him shortly. I'm just going to repeat here something I said at last year's inaugural conference about what we mean by the greater good here. The question is whether you care about and apply your talents and education toward advancing the good of others than just yourself. Whether in a single specific ethical decision involving just one other person's welfare or a lifelong pattern as a way of being, that is a simple definition of greater good that interests me. At the first Greater Good Gathering, a year ago, we talked about that in the context of governments and governance. This year, we're framing the discussion in terms of community. What today's technologies are doing to tear apart our sense of community, from the most personal of interactions on up to global relations, as well as the potential these same technologies promised and still hold to bring us together. We'll start today by encapsulating these issues in examples everyone knows about because they're now daily headlines. We'll end the day with a more hopeful vision of how the same technologies are being used to fight oppression and create communal interactions around the world. Tomorrow, we'll spend a full day exploring these themes from the ground up, so to speak, starting with how these phenomena shape human cognition, then how that affects our relationships with others, to what that portends for the nature of trust and the pursuit of truth, for democracy, and for global issues of confrontation and cooperation. We'll again conclude on a more hopeful note with students who are using technology to stretch the boundaries of public policy and advance the greater good in all sorts of creative ways. Let me conclude with what we'll do after that. I actually didn't set out to start a conference, and it's clear to me that we can't just end with a conference. In part, I hope this is merely one step in a conversation that continues amongst all of us for weeks and months to come. In part, I hope our friends here from the media help amplify what's discussed here to bring others into the conversation. But beyond that, this Greater Good initiative will involve a series of continuing activities nationwide in scope to bring Americans across the country into conversations like this about how we can collectively make the world and our small places in it better. I'm working with some people at the RAND Institute and other higher ed institutions, and with a cross-section of political professionals and opinion experts on a new initiative coming out of this to replicate this kind of discussion on a smaller scale, but in communities across the country, and then blend these voices together technologically into an ongoing interactive nationwide conversation. The conversation will culminate in Greater Good Gathering 3.0, where we'll be talking about the implications of these technologies for the economy and the resulting political upheavals felt throughout the world today. We'll be announcing details of this in the spring. In the meantime, let's get this conversation started, and for that purpose, it's my pleasure to introduce Merritt Janow, Dean of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, our host for this event, and apparently a colleague of mine at Columbia Law School, which I didn't know. Anyway, Merritt, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Eric, for bringing this really interesting initiative to SEPA and to Columbia, where I feel it really belongs here very naturally. SEPA, as you know, is the interdisciplinary hub of policy research and engagement at Columbia. And a lot of our students, are thinking about the intersection of technology and public policy, which is cutting across our core fields here. I want to particularly thank our partners across the university. I'm really pleased when SEPA can work with other parts of the university and departments. And we have a number who have joined in this effort. And I also want to acknowledge our own faculty members, Esther Fuchs and Robert Shapiro, both of whom have played a lead role in bringing this together at SEPA. So, I think, when we first kind of came to realize the potential of the internet and interconnection and the power of globalization, we thought these trends were going to bring the world together, And I think what we found is that there have been tremendous opportunities unleashed, opportunities for creativity and entrepreneurship, but also new drivers of polarization and divisiveness that have also profoundly revealed themselves in the United States and across the world. And I've come to think of the power of social media and data is really an amplifier, of our own tendencies within societies in ways we really profoundly need to think about. We started at SEPA a couple years ago something I've called the Technology and Policy, the Tech and Policy Initiative, which was really aimed at introducing more of a curriculum around the way technology and data were changing our core fields, because our students are trying to change the world, trying to contribute to public policy by going into government, nonprofit organizations, and business. And technology and data are part of the skill set that they must have to be effective in these different settings, as well as through entrepreneurship. But these are also areas that require new research, and strangely under-researched, I think, still. And the channels that I think we've deepened in recent time has been around cybersecurity, internet governance, and the digital economy. But there are so many new dimensions in each of those very big categories that I think warrant deep scholarship and engagement in the world around data governance and privacy, new regulatory frameworks, opportunities for civic tech, and all of these subjects and more are really very natural places for SEPA, working in collaboration with other parts of the university. So I think what you've brought together is quite a sprawling agenda, but with a clear logic to it, and I welcome that and I applaud you for doing that. And I hope that it also contributes to our own student engagement as well as future faculty research and training. So thank you very much for bringing this to SEPA and Columbia. And I look forward to a very exciting day. You have remarkable speakers. I thank all of you for coming here today, and hope we will come from this motivated to do more. Thank you.
Intro the panel up here for a second, please. So if you are Chris Wilson, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, Mauricio Moura, or Eli Kaplan, please come on up. This is our first panel. My name is James Fallows. Please have a seat. And so actually, I will take one of the end seats as, so yes, thank you so much. So I'll join you in a second. So my name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for The Atlantic magazine. I've known Eric Schnurer since he was in college, when we were working together on the Jimmy Carter speechwriting enterprise. I've known Janow over the years. I'm really delighted to be here to see the flourishing of this gathering and to the partnership with Columbia and Eric's works. And I think I'm really looking forward to the conversation over the next day or so. The way in which this, I'll stand here for the next 2 minutes setting up this panel, then I will join my people in this end seat and ask you all questions. The way in which we're going to begin our panel's part of this presentation is talking about the way some of the modern technologies of communication are affecting, for better and worse, the ways in which communities hold together. We discuss public issues. We try to do our business as a collectivity. This is a matter of ongoing long-term interest for me, which I'll explain this way. A little more than 20 years ago, while I was working for The Atlantic then too, I wrote a book called Breaking the News, whose subtitle was How the Media Undermine American Democracy. And its argument was that the nascent technology of that era, which was 24/7 cable news, was just beginning to arise. The Fox News channel had just been launched. There was a sense of the distractedness and challenges to existing journalistic organizations, the ways in which that was making it harder to get the information necessary for a democratic government, democratic populace to do its business. And I tried to point out there something I think is worth remembering as a background to our discussion, which is this is a very old problem in a very new form. The very old problem is how people get relevant information on developments that are not within their immediate personal experience. This is an old problem back to Plato and the shadows in the cave. It's an old problem in journalism. I talked a lot in my book about the one-time editor of the then Manchester Guardian, Mr. Scott, who was quoting Matthew Arnold and saying, the function of journalism in a democracy is to see things steady and see them whole. Give people a picture of life that was proportionate and not wrenched around by a spectacle, entertainment, and all the rest, and how we manage to do that with the technology of 20 years ago and the technology of today. It's a problem that about roughly 100 years ago, Walter Lippmann discussed in Public Opinion when he was raising the phenomenon of pictures in our head, how we were able to think about war in Europe, about conditions in China, about developments in other parts of the world we didn't directly experience, and what the mediating technologies did for the realism or the lack of realism of the ways in which we could decide. The positive news, to a degree, I have to give you is that I have recent evidence that the ways that when the American public is able to judge experiences from direct firsthand contact, more or less the American public is still sane. This is the theme of the book that my wife Deb and I have done over the past 4 or 5 years of going around the country in smaller town America and finding that at the community level, people are able to integrate immigrants and make long-term plans and reach reasonable compromises and have fact-based decisions for the future. So in the realm of firsthand experience, there is still a sense of people behaving the way we would like small d democracies to behave. And even just yesterday, AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, put out the results of a gigantic nationwide survey that was really robust in its data sets conducted last summer in July and August of 2018, and they found that by a very substantial, more than 2-to-1 margin, people were concerned about what was happening in America as a whole. But by nearly a 3-to-1 margin, Americans across economic categories, across races, across political affiliations felt that their own communities were doing well. Their own communities were going in the positive direction. And it's a study worth reading. And so that question of how a population that is able to make more or less reasonable and future-oriented decisions from their own experience, how it deals with the changing by the month mediation of experience, and which is making them feel bad about the country, suspicious of the world, suspicious of their neighbors, polarized about events of the world. That is one of the challenges that our panel will be discussing, and I think we'll be running through some of our discussions over this next 2 days. Here's going to be a prelude. This is going to be the order in which we will be hearing presentations briefly, and then we'll have a panel discussion for this first session. First, Mauricio Moura, who is an international specialist in these sorts of issues, will speak to us about some of the international dimensions and the ways in which he's seen targeted political advertising, more and more specialized delivery of political messages, the ways in which he has seen this work around the world, not necessarily in the United States. I'm going to abbreviate the description of all of our panelists, except for this detail about Mr. Moura. One of his many academic roles was a professor of econometrics at the pronounced with an English accent, Universidade Presbyteriana Mackenzie. My family heritage is all Mackenzies from Scotland, so I assume that we have some connection. So that's why you're going first. That's one reason why you're going number first. Second, we're going to hear from Chris Wilson, who has extensive experience in Republican Party use of very specific messaging, ways in which to understand the psychometrics of an audience. He has worked recently in the campaigns for Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott in Texas, for Brian Kemp in Georgia, for Ron DeSantis in Florida. So he can tell us about some of the recent experience and what he's learned about the American electorate, what he's learned about ability to parse messages and direct them. And so he will tell us about that. Then we're going to hear next from Eli Kaplan, who has complementary experience on the Democratic side of being one of the pioneers in trying to have digital marketing and presentation of political messages through the media of this modern age. And he will talk to us. I think you'll have then the complementary message to what we've heard from Chris Wilson. And finally, it will be Kathleen Hall Jamieson, whom you all know is a longtime head of the Annenberg School at Penn, and I think you were one of the viziers that I quoted back in Breaking the News, and ever since. Whenever I write a story about the meaning of the press, I always am going to quote Kathleen of both ways in which to think about the long-lasting, the contemporary, and the future problems of assessing knowledge of truth and trying to have the right kind of environment for democratic governance. We'll have a brief presentation from each of our panelists. We'll have a discussion among them, then we'll engage all of you, and that is our plan for the next while. So let me now, I'm going to go join the group here, and Mauricio Moura will lead us off. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Eric, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in this such interesting conference. And I want to highlight, I think, 4 issues that comes to mind in terms of technology, especially in political arena, in political campaign. The first one, and I see that globally, is that the politicians and the government, they are analogic and people are digital. So that's a huge gap between what's happening in the people's lives and how the politicians and the governments are approaching them with the technology. I always say there is an interesting number from Facebook that says that we, in average, look at our cellular phones 30 times per day to go into the web. So we basically go to our cell phones more often than sometimes you go to your spouse to talk. So the cellular phone are really part of every political discussion as of today. So it's my first point. So understand that and deal with that is very new, not only for politicians and for the governments, also for the media in general. The second point I want to make is that last year, in Mexico and Brazil especially, we learned that the election was played in the WhatsApp environment. I don't know, most of Americans have WhatsApp to talk to people outside the US, but the WhatsApp in elections outside the US is huge. We did a survey in Mexico and Brazil, and 95% of the voters responded that they got political content in a daily basis during the presidential campaigns in Mexico and Brazil. And in this year, we estimate that the WhatsApp is going to play a very important role in the Indian elections. Just to an estimate that India has around 400 million active WhatsApps. And remember that WhatsApp has a different future from Facebook, from other social networks. There is no algorithm separating people. So there, in the Facebook, and as you know, we are creating bubbles of discussions. The WhatsApp, people have what they call WhatsApp groups. And in average, any individual that has a active WhatsApp belongs to a family group, to a work colleagues group, to a former school, whatever group. So the capacity of sharing information in WhatsApp is huge. And we are not seeing that discussion because in Facebook, we kind of see what's going on in the different bubbles, né? But WhatsApp, no. The third point that we are facing, and this is a huge problem, is the fake news. And when the presidential election ended in Brazil, we did a survey, and 90% of the voters said they received fake news in their WhatsApps, And from those, 20% said that they shared the fake news. So people admitted to share, because there's a lot of people that don't, of course, when you ask them, don't admit to share. So it's a huge problem, because people are disseminating those fake news that they got in a platform, and they disseminate to family, to colleagues. And as you know, if you got something from your friend or something close, there's much more value than if you got randomly in your timeline in Facebook. And the fourth issue that I want to mention, that is a goal to any political approach to technology, is the data privacy. I think this is a big discussion globally. It's interesting to see that in the US that become much larger issue after the Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook discussion. But we have the GDPR in Europe. That's a big thing for data privacy. We have in Latin American countries are discussing that. So the question from now on is how can you relate data privacy, and how can you share content and have those political discussions in those platforms that are very open and very complex. So those are big issues right now that we are seeing, and I think the India election this year is going to present all those challenges.
Great, thank you very much, Mauricio. So Mauricio has, let's see if I'll just project. Do I have a mic here? I will project. So Mauricio has laid out for us 4 important themes that will run through our discussion: that politicians are analog and voters are digital, the importance of the WhatsApp app, the challenge of fake news, and the ways in which privacy issues are involved here. Before turning to Chris Wilson, you had, just to set up what you're going to say, before you started WP Intelligence, PA Intelligence, you worked for Weber Shandwick. You've had some experience with Cambridge Analytica, which has been very much in the news. From your experience in the last couple of years in this area that has been such a focus of press attention, of psychometrics, of targeted ads, and being able to sort of fragment the electorate, what do you think we should understand different from the way we do? Just tell us how we should think about these issues.
Sure. Well, I was planning to actually be very brief, so I was hoping to just turn over to Eli and hear everything the Democrats have planned for 2020. But I will. My role for Senator Cruz was I was his Director of Research Analytics and Digital Strategy in the 2016 campaign. And in that role, I did manage Cambridge Analytica, and I'm happy to address that. The challenge with Cambridge Analytica, though, is, let me put this out of the way at the beginning, there are really 3 things that you have to understand, or three ways to discuss them. One is to understand what they said they were going to do. 2 is to understand what they said they did. And then 3 is to understand what they actually did, which had literally no resemblance to the first or the second. And that is Cambridge Analytica to me on the Cruz campaign, and this was different because they were hired before I was. So when I came in, they were sort of running a digital data operation. That was, we announced on March 23rd of 2015. Isn't that remarkable to think that, how many Democrats have announced now? Are we up to 10 yet? And we were the first to announce in 2015, for the 2016 elections. We still had not announced. So it's amazing how much more quickly this is beginning. But having said that, they were already online. By May, they were a data science staffing firm. And this has been well written about. Izzy Lepowski was here for Wired Magazine. I've talked about this extensively. And it was like, they very quickly moved into a role that they played very well, which was sort of like an express personnel services for data scientists. And they did a good job of that. And my team was great at data science. So having said that, let me now kind of address what I plan to say actually, because I think it is, to go to your original point about the challenges that we face in politics, and it is communicating directly to voters and doing that in a world in which we had seen voting participation decline. I believe we had seen that participation decline because the ability to communicate directly to voters about issues that they were concerned about specifically, that spoke to them personally, had also declined. Well, what happened in 2016? We saw the largest turnout. I'll just speak to the Republican side because I can go through it case by case. I'm still going through therapy for much of that. Is the race against Donald Trump kind of put me into. And I point out, I had dinner last week with a good friend of mine, Alon Kriegel, who was Hillary Clinton's director of analytics. And I continually tell him, you went up against him once. I did it 42 times. So I'm still in recovery here. But we had record turnout in 2016 in the primaries. To give you just one example, in Iowa, in 2008, it was 114,000 people voted. in this, I could be give or take 5,000 on this. In 2012, it was 119,000. And then in 2016, we had 167,000 people turn out. You jump forward to 2018. What happened is we saw the largest turnout since 1914. 104 years, the largest turnout. I am an optimist about data. I am an optimist about politics. I believe the use of data in political campaigns is at least as important as the use of data in selling you products through Amazon or recommending you a television show through Netflix. And what I mean, now, having said that, let me be clear, I do believe everybody should have absolute and complete control of their own data, which they do not today. But they don't when it comes to Netflix or Amazon either. That's a problem that must be fixed. Really, we do have the ability to fix it, but like everybody else here, I just hit agree every time something pops up and asks me whether I agree or disagree. Oh, yeah, of course I agree. Take my kids away, whatever it takes. I just want to get watch this movie. Or kill some birds that look angry. But the point is that I believe the use of that data, the ability to speak to voters specifically about issues they care about directly to them through a medium in which they consume information, had that impact in motivating voters, certainly in our primary in 2016. I'd like to think we had something to do with that. And then in 2018, in the races you spoke about, each one of those states had record turnouts. Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma, Montana, Arizona. I could go through every state we were involved in where we did statewide races. And it was, I believe, the ability to communicate on behalf of many analog politicians, as you so articulately stated, to a digital, a group of voters that does receive information digitally, whether it's through their tablet, through their cell phone, through their TV, and the ability to target directly on TV, which is increasing more and more every day, the ability to run an ad directly on a television show or through Roku or through Hulu. I mean, the ability to do that, I believe, is changing politics, and I believe, like I said, I'm an optimist about it. Although there are negatives, it is a net positive, and I think that is represented in the fact that turnout has increased as dramatically as it has over the last few cycles.
Great, thank you. So let's turn now to Eli Kaplan, both to talk about the complementary Democratic side experience you've had, and to sort of to begin to cue up the next discussion of how we can positively work with the technology of today to have some kind of workable governance.
Thank you. I think it's interesting because even as we've seen an increased technological ability to cheaply communicate to using micro-targeting techniques, and probably more so on the left than the right, the dominant medium of political campaigning continues to be a broadcast medium where you're talking to basically everybody with the exact same message. So I'm not sure that I would attribute, each individual moment or greater turnout to the mechanics of campaigns, but rather the broader environment that we live in. But I think this is a trend that is going to exacerbate dramatically in the next few election cycles. And there are a couple things that I think are important to think about that, both in terms of how we've gotten to this point and where we're going forward. The first is that this isn't unique to digital, and I think you mentioned that kicking off these remarks that we've had interesting moments at the beginning of cable news, but the ability to use data and track individuals goes well beyond what's happened in political campaigns and this particular moment. When you go to the grocery store and you get a coupon, your behavior has been tracked, and it's been used to serve direct marketing techniques via mail and other ways for a variety of different times, for a very long time. And so I think it's necessary to sort of parse out the data privacy component to what's going on versus the transparency component, which is something that I feel like we sort of had an abject failure for several election cycles now to tackle something that really blew up in our faces in the 2016 election. It became very apparent to me, working on a variety of different campaigns as early as 2012, that there was a giant loophole in the way that digital campaigns were working. And that whereas, on television, if you were to spend a large amount of money, that would be reported and shared very quickly, whether it was on broadcast or cable, with all of the relevant players who were covering and competing in a political campaign. But in digital, it was clear that because there were no transparency guidelines, the government hadn't regulated this stuff. In many states, the word internet wasn't even in the code that regulates elections. The ad tech companies like Google and Facebook, unlike in cable television where they would freely share, hey, this group placed this spy and is spending this amount of money to influence the election, none of that was going on. In fact, most of the big players considered it a breach of privacy to say what was going on. And then I think you had the media who kind of dropped the ball in sounding the alarm bells of all of this, even though I felt like a lot of this was very predictable. And as we're transferring from a broadcast medium to one that I think is going to be increasingly individualized in terms of the type of communications that you get online and in your social media feeds, we really haven't solved the problem. There hasn't been government regulation in this area. The big advertising technology companies some of them have had minimal amounts of regulation, others have had basically none. And I'm not sure that we've really done a whole lot to address the challenges that we've seen in 2016 when thinking about how they can impact future elections.
Great. Thank you very much, Eli. I'm going to borrow we're going to share a microphone back and forth as the Mackenzies on the platform here, and then the others will all have theirs individually. Thanks very much for that, Eli. Now for this opening round, Kathleen, you have written over the years about the ways in which the press does and does not engage properly with democracy. You have a recent book, Cyber War, about the ways in which you contend that modern social technology played an important part in this most recent election. What would you add to this set of a conversation of how we should be thinking about functioning of democracy with these digital tools?
I used to debate first negative, so let me try to respond to each, but just creating a different context. The concept of fake news is deeply problematic to me because you destabilize the notion news when you say fake news. For me, fake news is an oxymoron. So when we use the words fake news, we've essentially adopted a category which in some circles means anything I don't like that is represented in a construct called news. I would prefer to say we want to mark off those things that we object to, so we're more likely to be able to see them and then deal with them on the grounds that we object. I'd like to call it viral deception, VD for short. I want the venereal disease notion to be operative. I'd like to have disgust at the notion that something is circulating in viral form and is deceptive outside the structures of traditional media analysis, the gatekeeping structures that could create a context, and outside the awareness of the opposing political candidates, who also have an obligation in our system to catch deceptions about them and get them conceptualized. So I'd like to think in terms of the virality and the deception and ask how the capacities of a digital culture increase the likelihood of like-minded transmission inside communities that have amalgamated, in part because they are like-minded and as a result are not going to spot the deceptive nature but do produce increased virality. On the second theme of mobilization, I think it's wonderful when we see increased numbers of voters mobilized. And I think using digital capacities to be able to do that is potentially extraordinarily important. But we've been studying over the decades as we've looked at elections, the ways in which people vote, not simply whether they vote. And let me stipulate, voting is good. But if you cast a vote against something instead of for something, you've lost the tie between campaigning and governance. And if we get into an environment in which the digital capacity increases the likelihood that what we circulate is fear and anger and hate against someone, and as a result discredit them, instead of making the case that my candidate will be better than that candidate because on these issues the person will behave differently, and temperamentally and in competence, et cetera, on all those other characterological dimensions, my candidate is better too. We've created a structure that makes it more difficult for campaigning to forecast governance, and that fundamentally undercuts some of the representative capacity of our system. So if our digital environment is increasing the likelihood that we're sharing viral content within like-minded communities without correction, is premised more on bigotry, anger, and fear than it otherwise would be, and we increase no voting as opposed to yes voting, contrastive voting. We reduce contrastive voting, and we say, I'm just going to vote because I despise that person. I think we've done something highly problematic for democracy. And then if we set back and say, one of the capacities that digital age has given us is micro-targeting. And I'm using a little bit different language because I want to use the language we used to use when we talked about it when it was in the broadcast era, the cable era, the radio era. Candidates have always had the capacity to micro-target. They've always tried to get content to their own supporters, and sometimes it's great. They're telling them what they want to hear, not pandering to them, actually telling them what they will do in office. It's a forecast of governance, and it's accurate. That's all terrific. And if we increase the likelihood that gets to people who need to know it, bravo, we've increased the capacity of campaigns to forecast governance. But we've always also had the capacity just to find the people who could be manipulated and to lie to them. So for example, using micro-targeting through radio, a medium people don't tend to look at anymore. In 2008, the Obama campaign lied to voters about McCain's position on stem cell research. Radio. It was not picked up by the fact checkers. I run factcheck.org. Although Eugene Kiley heads it, I'm ultimately responsible for the thing. We picked it up late. The likelihood that we could get the correction, McCain's actual position on stem cell research, he had bucked his party to oppose the president of his own party on it, and the ad was dissembling about the fact that he had done that. They were stating his position was the exact opposite of what it was. What that did, that micro-targeted ad did, was, according to a rolling cross-sectional survey, we were running it at the time, which means we're in the field every single day, we can generalize day-to-day variability, it shaped the perceptions of voters who were deceived and may have cast a vote against John McCain that they otherwise might not have cast. Now jump forward to a digital age in which we've heightened the capacity to micro-target because of all of this information that we can now aggregate about the individual and our capacity to reach that individual in channels in which no one else is monitoring. And the difference between that 2008 move and 2016 is it undoubtedly was happening a great deal and no one knew it was there.
So thank you, Kathleen. Your training as debater comes in very well here. There are a number of rich questions you've laid out. I'd like to actually have Eli and Chris respond to what you were saying about a fundamental contrast between tools that make for more and more effective campaigning and whether these are fundamentally contradictory to effective governance, whether the tools that allow people to become more motivated, including in negative ways, can get us into a vicious cycle of government. Well, Eli, what's your sense about that?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that is difficult for me, being a political hack, is that that's not my job. You know, my job is to give candidates advice about the best way that they can win elections, and it's up to them to be effective in governing. I certainly think that there's a lot to that point, which is that, you know, if you go too far, you're going to be unable to effectively govern. And sometimes, you know, I've been in conversations where folks want to achieve certain public policy objectives, but, you know, looking at the data, there's just not a path to get there to win an election campaigning on exactly those sets of priorities. So obviously, I think if you're able to do it, that is going to be a whole lot more effective. But I also think that there's a distinction between, you know, being honest about making comparisons between what you're doing and what your opponent is doing, and the type of things that, you know, Dr. Jamieson just pointed out, which are completely factually untrue. And, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important that we sort of get this transparency stuff right, so that campaigns can be held accountable, and people in my position are not ever put in a situation where, you know, it should be such that if you put out really egregious stuff that is factually wrong, your candidate is penalized for it, and they are less likely to win an election. And increasingly, the way that these technologies are going, I'm not sure that that's the direction that we're headed at all.
And before turning to you, Chris, I wanted to reinforce one thing Kathleen was saying about the long provenance of these kind of targeted messages. Of course, back during Abraham Lincoln's era, there were campaign flyers about him depicting him as a gorilla or an ape to certain markets. And in Georgia politics, where I once worked, I think it was Herman Talmadge, or somebody, apocryphally at least for Herman Talmadge, he would say his opponent's sister was a known thespian, for example. This kind of argument going on. So Chris, you know, you've been involved in some of the really bare-knuckled, I mean, with the Trump campaign, was in a way epitomizing the contrast between getting people angry and preparing for governance. How do you think about Kathleen's point about there's a tension between getting people motivated and preparing them to govern?
Yeah, it's I mean, I agree with almost everything Eli said except for the last part. The last part about where we were heading, I think I would disagree with. I do believe we were heading to a point where transparency is increasing. And your point about Trump, that didn't really exist in the primary. They didn't have much of a campaign, a digital data campaign in the primary. That emerged in the general election. And the primary was really just all him speaking, and all three networks covering him constantly, from the second he got off the plane to the second he got back on. It was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen in terms of press coverage of a single candidate. But, not that I'm bitter or anything. But from a standpoint of where we were moving, as I'm sure most people are aware, Facebook changed their policies, and you can now go back and look at all of our ads from 2016. You can go back and look at all the ads that campaigns are running. I do think that had a sort of a cleansing effect because the transparency it created, for at least on Facebook. Now, also as Eli mentioned, the #1 medium is still broadcast, and that has always been accessible. We can go, and when somebody puts an ad on television, we have access to it, and we can pull it down from multiple services. There are still some services in which we don't have that ability, but it is becoming increasingly difficult for a campaign to do what they did in 2016, which is run an ad without anybody finding out about it. I will tell you, at least in the campaigns I was involved in, even where they were running ads trying to target through apps, like you see an ad pop up on Yelp or ESPN or things like that. In 2016, we didn't know about that until it was too late. In 2018, we had it because people became more aware of the problem. We had it sent to us almost within hours after they were running. So it may not be, the transparency may be more of a sort of like a posse or a vigilantes kind of reporting people, but at least it's becoming outside of Facebook. I think it is more difficult for someone to do the sort of, there's a line between running a negative ad where you're saying, giving a truth about someone's record, and doing what Kathleen described, what was done to John McCain, saying something that is untrue about their record. And when that happens, that's when you cross the line. And I agree 100% with what Eli said. I think when a campaign does that, I can honestly say I've not been involved in a campaign that I know that has done that. Said, hey, this candidate did not vote this way, but we're going to go say it because we think it'll help us win the election. Frankly, if I did, I'd leave. I would resign immediately. And I don't know anybody in this business that I work with who would stay involved. At least I hope I don't. But it is, if you made that decision, if it was ever found out, I think your campaign would be over almost immediately.
Before asking Mauricio about another aspect of this, I have a quick follow-up for you. This could last a long time, but a quick answer. I think you're the only person in the room who's worked with Cambridge Analytica, and probably the only one who's worked in Republican primaries. What is your visceral response when you read news reports that Cambridge Analytica essentially swung the election?
It's just a joke. I will say, for anybody who worked with them or covered them or dealt with anyone there outside of speaking to their CEO, Alexander Nix, and I'm sure everyone has seen the expose that Channel 4 in Britain did where they're recording him talking to the man who's posing as a Sri Lankan candidate, or maybe a Sri Lankan fan, I can't remember what exactly he's posing as. I mean, it was just such bullshit that you sit there and listen to it and you're just you are appalled that someone could make statements that are so patently false and knowingly false. It's remarkable to me that it got away with it as long as he could. Now I will tell you, Vicki Ward wrote a good piece in Huffington Post called "The Blow It Up Billionaires," I believe is the name of it, in which she details point by point sort of our experience with them on the Cruz campaign and then the experiences they had with the Trump campaign. And it was the kind of the claims that they made. And what's funny about it is I have so many journalist friends who were talking to them and said, they were doing off the record, but background conversations in which they were completely cleansing themselves of any responsibility of the Trump campaign the day of the election. And then there's this great photo you can find on Getty where it's a picture of Alexander Nix trying to get in. He's the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, or was, trying to get in to the party, and he's being held back, I think, by Kellyanne Conway. And he's like, please, I want to get up there. Because, just that day he was telling reporters they had zero chance to win. So yeah, they did. I mean, he strapped a flag to his back and ran victory laps between London and Washington, D.C. for the entire spring of 2017. But for them to make claims that it had something to do with Trump's election is just completely laughable.
Thank you. Mauricio, I'll give you the microphone in a second. You heard, or you can borrow Chris's. So Kathleen Hall Jamieson was saying that instead of the term fake news, she thought there should be this new VD term for viral deception. Does your international experience make you think there is any hope for sort of reestablishing any gatekeeper, truth teller, fact checker, viral deception type standard? You can have 2 microphones.
Thank you. Before answering, I just want to agree with one point that was made about the no vote is actually more important sometimes with the vote. And one thing that she said that elections actually, what I feel globally, are represented to voters as a binary decision, always a referendum. If you got that, or you got America great again, or you are a socialist, or you got a Brexit and take control, or you don't take control. So those are the way that are presented to voters. It's always a referendum, binary decision. Some places you have votes that you can ranking candidates and options, but still the narratives are very easy put as a referendum, and that's very tough. On the what would you ask? Is there a way to okay, the fake news. Honestly, in the short term, no. What I see, I'm gonna make a comparison, and I liked about the virus stuff. This is a very good metaphor. And one thing that we learn virus historically is that you only deal with them with a lot of education. And we are going to have to start educating since like kindergarten to people to start asking themselves every time they got a content in their cellular phone, what is this content? Is this really true? Is this something that if I share have an impact? This is, I believe, it's all about education, because we are seeing, and when I talk about fake news, it's all false claims or false information. And when I see people above 60 years old working in WhatsApp in India, in Brazil, in Mexico, and sharing fake news, we're not talking about young people. We see there's a long road to educate people about analyzing information.
I'm going to put you all on the spot with a question. It's sort of the last big picture question before I involve people from the crowd, because most of us are practiced as analysts or activists in some sense, as opposed to sort of prescriptive reformers. I'm going to put you all in the reformer and prescriptive mode in the following way. There is a fundamental tension between technology in governance and governance, which is sort of the subject of this entire conference, that technology, this kind of information technology, can more and more precisely target information to the person, what I want, what my children want, what my spouse wants, et cetera. But governance, by definition, has to be us, not me, but us. It has to be some kind of greater good, some common interest. I mentioned earlier that at the community level, people still seem able to manage that conflict. They can say, yes, I'm going to have to pay higher taxes for this bond issue for schools, but it's worth it for the community. That kind of management is practical. I'd like each of you, from your respective expertises, to say how, given the technology you have assessed so acutely here, how we can improve the balance, find some way to reset the collective good, which is necessary for governance. Anybody in a democratic system must have, keep a majority eventually on his or her side. What we can do to kind of to have more of the us interest in a time when the me interest is more and more precisely defined. Professor Jamieson, I'm going to start with you. What do you think we can do to use this technology and discipline it in a sustainable and survivable way?
One of the things we know about the capacity of news is that the news has the capacity to set an agenda which focuses on some things and not on others. To the extent that the press now is chasing tweets and letting an agenda be set almost hour by hour in different places, it's sacrificing its capacity to talk about the common goods that we need to address as a collectivity. I am astonished, given the fact that the Democrats and Republicans both agreed that we had an infrastructure crisis in 2016, that they did not find a way to tee up solutions. And I blame the press for not holding those candidates accountable for taking the common ground all parties articulated in 2016 and holding them accountable in governance. And when the news does not say this is important, here's why it's important, we do not in common have that as a priority enough that we are going to exercise our accountability function by saying to those people who told us in 2016 they were going to address it, where is it? So I am embarrassed for the Democrats and the Republicans and for the press that we have cities whose water systems are unreliable right now. And this isn't just Flint, Michigan. This is any city that is older than about 40 to 50 years old. That we have road structures that are embarrassing in a country of our stature. And Donald Trump went around saying we're embarrassed by our airports. He's absolutely right. Compare our airports and our rail system to those in the other, what you'd call great countries around the world. And we don't look like we belong in the same class. So to the extent that there is a common problem and a common need, and we don't focus on it, I blame the press and our political leaders.
I'm going to follow up with one very specific, and yes, but I'll pause for you, applaud a little more, because that's a very good point. Then I'll follow up with a question. So like many in the room, I am in the press. Here's something I know firsthand. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've written hundreds of posts about the way Dodge City, Kansas is incorporating its new majority Latino population, or the way that Fresno, California is training the children of migrant workers for better futures, or the way that Allentown, Pennsylvania is reviving its downtown. And I've gotten big following for that. We have a best-selling book and all that. But I know if I write something in the next half hour saying that State of the Union speech was the worst written speech I've ever heard, it will get 10 times the traffic on the Atlantic site. That just is the reality. Anything you write about Trump or anything that's sort of white hot, the politics of this minute, will get 10 times literally the attention. We at the Atlantic tried to then meter that, doing only so many "this is horrible" by Trump pieces and more "here's what's happening in Fresno." What do you advise people in the press in a market environment to do about this reality?
Salience predicts attention, and if talented reporters who write better than any of us can't find a way to make salient the fact that those who are immune compromised should not drink water in our urban centers, there's something wrong with their writing capacity or their conscience.
Thank you. So, and I will point out, our book about small-town America became a bestseller. So there. So Eli, as a practitioner, as you mentioned earlier, your practice is to try to get your side to win, which may involve techniques which make it harder to sort of knit together the civic fabric afterwards. What, based on your knowledge, would you do to allow for better governability of the United States in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to get these transparency requirements right. And I don't think that anyone has done a very good job so far. I think Facebook, to Chris's point, has made probably the most progress in terms of, like, if you put together a political ad now and you put money behind it, somebody can look up what happened. But one, they did that entirely by self-regulation, probably in the wake of the bad press that they got after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. There are tons of places on the internet that you can micro-target in much the same way that you can on Facebook's platform without having to disclose who paid for that advertisement. A lot of the places that have sought to do this regulation have gone completely overboard. And so in Washington State, for example, you can no longer advertise in any real way on the internet. You can't, if you're running for a non-federal office in Washington State, Google, Facebook, they won't take your advertisements. And as Mauricio pointed out, this is how people live and get their news, and you basically destroyed the ability of a political campaign to get out where a candidate believes they are on issues and set the agenda to a huge swath of the electorate that doesn't pay attention to anything except for digital media. And a lot of, I think, the proposals that are going on Capitol Hill to seriously address this problem, and I think they're well-intentioned, and my hope is that they can get this right, really risk some very bad unintentional consequences. Because a lot of the ways that I think people are talking about regulating publications, there's a big difference between the big folks that have walled gardens that collect tons of data, like Facebook and Google, and the way that you can buy advertisements across thousands of different local news affiliates and blogs and websites. And I think there's a risk that if you do this the wrong way, you end up making the big players bigger and starving good journalists of a way to get additional revenue, which they're finding harder and harder in today's digital environment.
So a follow-up for you before turning to Chris. I lived for a long time in China, which made me think there are sort of three great world regimes about the state and internet relationships. There's the Chinese regime, where the state says everything that the internet can do. There's the US regime, which has been presumptively what is technically possible and profitable should happen. Then there's the European regime of trying to regulate it in various ways. Which of the, do you think the European regime or the current American, if you can do it, you should do it, which of those models will prevail here, do you think?
Tough for me to choose, because I think there is a distinction between what Europe has done in GDPR, which is this, a lot of restrictions on data collection. I'm not sure you have to do that to get to a place where people can be held accountable for viral deception. I think there are mechanisms that you can do that are short of that are more in line with the American framework that we've chose not to do, with basically taking the small steps that Facebook has done and go a lot bigger with it to ensure that if you're putting out content on the internet, that you can be held accountable and people can know who put out that content and who paid for it.
Yeah. Chris, your positive recommendation based on your knowledge of the tools and the electorate of ways in which we could find better steps towards governability of the United States?
Well, I listen to what Kathleen pointed out, and I do get concerned about the way in which the media covers elections. I think there is, and governance too. And from that matter, however, I am also would be far more concerned about any sort of government regulation about how it is handled. But I mentioned a little bit ago, and I'll tell you, for anyone who wants to see what I'm talking about from the 2016 cycle, there's a study was done by MediaQuant.net, and again, I knew all these numbers after 2016, I forgot them now, but somewhere around it from January 1 through the end of May of 2016, if you took all the coverage of every single candidate and compiled it, Donald Trump got somewhere in the range of 70%, Hillary Clinton got somewhere in the range of 20%, and the rest was split up between all the other candidates. Remember, 16 candidates on the Republican side, on the Democrat side, 5 or 6 legitimate ones. And so from that standpoint, it made it very difficult for anybody to break through. And, as the campaign that stayed in the longest against Donald Trump and came in second, so most second place delegates since Ronald Reagan, 1976, not that I'm bragging, but I remember sitting at the Republican convention doing an Atlantic panel with Ron Brownstein and Kellyanne Conway. And I were talking about...
I was there.
Yeah, that's the same issue. And, how it was covered, and what does it mean, and where are we going to go from here? And at that point, I really felt like, and I started trying to be optimistic. I'm going to close being trying to be optimistic. I felt like what we had done, I said, my comment was, some of it's a failure on my part. If I had the time to prepare for every state the way I did for Iowa, in which we were able to understand every single voter, and understand as the electorate was expanding. We knew as that electorate grew from 124,000 to 176,000, or 167,000, sorry, and who we were communicating with and what we were saying with them and how we were reaching them. And that is why I believe we won Iowa. And in fact, if you go and look at the Real Clear Politics average, every single poll had Trump winning, and most had Rubio winning and going into second. But we knew internally we were going to win. And the reason for that is because we knew who we were talking to, we knew who we were going to vote, who was going to vote. And I believe that is the value behind the current sort of evolution of the ability to communicate digitally and the ability to understand voters from a data perspective. And so I am hesitant to see further restrictions, further governance be handed down, because I do believe in a modern environment. In a modern environment, 2020 is different than 2018, and 2018 was different than 2016. In a modern environment, if a campaign were to do some of the things that were done in 2016, and I'll just leave it unsaid who did them, they would be found out immediately, and they would lose the election because of that. And I think you can point to specific cases in 2018, specifically in primaries in which that did occur.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, Mauricio, your personal your personal views or your international experience on ways you've seen to take positive steps to allow to harness modern digital tools to governability?
First of all, I believe that the technology will evolve. So I agree. Every cycle, we're going to have different technology, and everything that you did 2 years ago doesn't work. I remember 10 years ago, the big discussion was how to use